Hello and welcome to another video review. This is The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. This is an action role-playing game by CD Projekt RED and the sequel to The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings. It was released in May of this year, and it received quite a lot of acclaim across pretty much everybody. Which of course begs the question of whether it actually is as good as people say it is or not. Because let's face it, whenever we're talking about the major publications here, there's always cause for just questioning. They're always very, very odd with how they dish out scores and things like that. So the real question becomes, does this thing measure up to expectations? And if it doesn't, then where does it actually end up falling? Because they build this thing as a sort of crowning achievement of the RPG genre, and all sorts of other weird things like that. So clearly there were a lot of promises made, and some people raised some stink over it when it finally came out, and it didn't look like it did when they were first releasing the announcement stuff for it. And others were raising stink for its depictions of racism and sexism and things like that. So let's just put this stuff aside for the time being and just get on with the review and find out just how this game actually is. Now let's start with the presentation, which of course brings me into discussion of the visuals, which in turn leads me into one of the big controversies with this game when it came out on PC anyway. And that is that it didn't look like it did back in 2013, and people were raising a hissy fit over it because how dare it not look amazing on PC, except that it does look amazing. Look at it right now. The game's frickin' gorgeous. It's got absolutely supreme detail on the modeling, and particularly with facial animations, but also just the animations in general, where everything is very smooth and fluid and flows together really well. The only issue I really had with some of the visuals was that on certain objects, some of the textures aren't as good as they could be. Namely, when you go into the wilderness and you find yourself up against a mountain, some of the rock textures on the mountain might be a bit lower res than everything else that you've seen thus far. So it doesn't pop up all that often, but when it does, if you know what to look for, you will notice it. It's not enough to break the visuals in any stretch of the imagination. This game still looks fantastic, and the amount of detail they just put into even the simple things is wonderful. Things like if you go into water, if you completely submerge, Geralt comes out and he's wet. But if you only partially submerge, it will only put a wetness layer on whatever actually was in the water. So for example, if Geralt goes into the water and he only goes up to his knees, only the bits up to his knees will actually be wet when he gets out of the water. It's a really nice touch, and there's other really nice touches all over the place as well. Things like the way that the foliage moves when you walk into it and such like that. It just all blends together to make the game look fantastic. It's not without problems, however. There is one major feature of the NVIDIA-specific stuff called Hairworks, which absolutely tanks your frame rate if you try to start it up. It's basically NVIDIA's equivalent of Tress effects. It renders hair with tessellation, effectively. And the settings they have for it in the base config file are actually too high. So if you lower those a bit, it still looks great, but it doesn't impact your performance anywhere near as much. Now, I'm running a 970 and an i7 4790K, and if I turn on Hairworks, it will absolutely tank my frame rate from being basically above 65 at all times, except for very occasional drops into the 50s. And it will go straight down into the 40s, and it will basically just stay there. So that should tell you how demanding Hairworks can be if you don't edit the config file to fix it. So ultimately I just ended up turning off Hairworks entirely. It doesn't really add all that much, but it is a really nice thing to have, particularly when you're looking at monsters. The way it renders the hair on the monsters and the feathers and such like that, it looks great on the monsters. On people, not as much. But really, it's not that important of a feature, so I just turned it off, got the extra frame rate, and the game looks great still. It just doesn't have that slightly extra pizzazz, so to speak. And of course, the game has run better since driver updates and patching has taken place. They've been very, very good about getting patches out for this thing, fixing myriad problems, and performance is definitely one of those things. So if you actually play this game and you have a fairly good system and you're still having issues, there is actually a pretty decent chance it'll be patched out. So we can't be fully certain on how this thing will perform in the future, but right now it's running very well and it looks fantastic. And then there's the sound design, which is basically as it was in The Witcher 2 in terms of both sound effects and voice acting. It's still pretty high quality. You do have Charles Dance in this thing, playing Emir var Emreis, which is the Emperor of Nilfgaard, and of course he does a very good job as the Emperor. You will probably know this actor as playing Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones, so he's basically the perfect choice to play this kind of tough Emperor figure. And like I said, he does a great job. And most of the other characters have very good voice acting as well, although some of them are better than others. For example, Triss just doesn't sound all that great, but she never really did sound all that great in the Witcher series, so kind of moot, I guess? And I would imagine that the voice acting is a bit better in Polish, simply because it's a Polish game, and some things can be lost in translation. But I didn't play it with the Polish voiceovers and English subtitles, so I can't really comment on that. And the sound effects themselves are generally pretty solid. One of the nice touches that they added in the visual department as well as the sound department is dismemberment, and when you dismember an enemy in this thing, it plays these kind of sickening, crunching, squishing noises that are just glorious and fit really, really well for the dismemberment. So they did a good job with that as well. But then there's the music, which if you remember my Witcher 2 review, I said that they could definitely go further with the Slavic influence in the soundtrack and that, because they had hints of it here and there, but they didn't go all out with it. In this one, most of the time they go all out with it. There's a lot of these kind of Slavic instruments playing. They got the band Percival to actually help them out with the soundtrack, and so some of the tracks in the game are actually based off of Percival's tracks. For example, Silver for Monsters. Which is one of the combat themes, is based off of Percival's song Sargon. And Steel for Humans is based off of Lazare. So they definitely went more with the Slavic influence this time around, and that shows across the entire game, not just the soundtrack, but they made pretty much everything fit exactly where it should. For example, when I first arrived in Skellige, it started playing the Fields of Ard-Skellig, which is absolutely perfect for how frickin' gorgeous Skellige is. Before that, you're wandering around in Velen, in No Man's Land, and it's not a particularly pleasant place. There's a lot of swamps, there's a lot of just dead things all over the place. And then you finally get to Skellige, and the music changes to fit the mood, which is this absolutely gorgeous landscape that is basically like if you combined Viking culture with sort of like a Scotland, Ireland, or Wales culture and just kind of smashed them together and didn't wipe away the bloody mess. And it just fits perfectly. So it's really nice that they managed to put more of that kind of Polish influence into the soundtrack, as well as just the presentation in general. It feels like they really drew on that kind of Slavic folklore feel, and it works wonders for this game's presentation. And even when they don't do just Slavic stuff and try to pull in other influences, it's done brilliantly and just, again, works wonders for the presentation. But as great as the presentation is, what really matters here are the story and the gameplay. The story takes place after the events of The Witcher 2, and you play once again as Geralt of Rivia, the mutated monster hunter who currently, when you start the game, is on the search for Yennefer, a sorceress who was his former lover at the time. And when you do eventually find her, you learn more about what the actual plot of the game is, which is that the Emperor of Nilfgaard is sending Geralt and Yennefer out to find Ciri, or Cirilla, who is the Emperor's daughter and a very, very major character in the books. If you haven't read the books before you play The Witcher 3, you might want to, because you will get a lot more out of the game if you have read the books. You can still play this game without having read the books and still get plenty out of it, since they do actually sum a few things up here and there to basically fill you in on just enough to know what's going on. But, like I said, you'll get a lot more out of it if you read the books. But the short version is that Ciri is the possessor of the Elder Blood, and she is basically master of time and space, which means she can go between worlds. People want to harness her power in order to use it to their own ends, and so she is basically on the run. Namely, she's on the run from the Wild Hunt, which is generally described as an army of wraiths that descends upon settlements, wipes them out completely, leaves just this frozen, barren landscape in its wake, and just keeps going. And there's not much people can do about it. Of course, Geralt knows better, and I'm not really going to go into why he knows better or what you can really expect from the Wild Hunt itself, but suffice to say, Geralt's task is to, of course, find Ciri before the Wild Hunt can get her. Because if the Wild Hunt gets her, very bad things will happen. And of course, finding Ciri in itself is also a very personal thing for both Geralt and Yennefer. But the plot from there goes into this sort of open world setting where you can explore Velen, Skellige, and Novigrad at your discretion. Now, it's advisable to do Velen first because that's where most of the low-level stuff is. So once you hit a certain point with your leveling, you can go to Skellige and basically be comfortable. But the game never really hinders your progress. You can go wherever you want to, really. And while there are certain benefits to going to certain areas first rather than others, you can pretty much do whatever. It just lets you loose, and if you think you can handle it, well, go for it. But regardless, most of the main decisions you will make that will influence the outcome of the plot are actually in Act 1, or are in side quests. And you will go through these various quests and make decisions that may not necessarily have all that much immediate outcome, but when you progress further into the game, they will have noticeable consequences, and they will be referenced back. And all of this stuff will lead to pretty wildly different endings. Even just simple dialogue choices can wildly change what happens in a given situation, or just not doing certain side quests in general. So it is definitely a role-playing game. You do definitely have some pretty solid choice and consequence going on, and it's pretty comparable to how it was in the previous game, where, again, most of your choices are made early on, and you see them play out as you progress through the game. Now, when I did finally get to the ending, choices I had made hours before became apparent. And while I was satisfied with my ending, I do feel this kind of drive to go back and try different things and see how differently it plays out, just because this game really does encourage you to go back and try it again in a different way. Now, whether you're tired of the gameplay at that point is another story entirely, which this is where my major problem with the game comes in. But before I get to that, let's first talk about those side quests. Like I said, a lot of the side quests do influence the outcome of the main plot. And frankly, this is some of the best side questing I have ever gone on in any game ever. Every single quest, no matter what it is, has its own storyline, its own mini plot within the greater context of the game. Even if you're doing simple Witcher contracts, which you would think would just be just your basic monster hunt, which is basically what it is, but when you go into it, you will find that it has its own plot line. Now, it's probably self-contained within the contract, but things can be fairly complicated. To give you an example of one contract I literally stumbled upon while I was just wandering around in the wilderness, I walked into this town overrun by ghouls. So I killed all the ghouls, that was no big deal. But I came to find out later that there was a Nilfgaardian patrol that went there, and they never reported back, so that was basically your quest giver, was a Nilfgaardian captain. But I just happened to stumble upon it, and I found out that the ghouls weren't actually what had killed the Nilfgaardian patrol. It was actually something else entirely that the villagers were basically covering up. And so, getting more to the point of the matter was something that just made that quest so much more satisfying than just simply go here, kill monsters. And that's the kind of thing you get with these side quests. They are just so much more satisfying than basically any quest I have ever seen in any other game. Most other games, you go on a side quest and it feels like it's just there to lengthen out the game. In this one, it really feels like they're a natural extension of just what you're doing in general. You're a witcher. You solve problems, mostly of the monster variety, but sometimes other things. You use your witcher senses for other things than just tracking down monsters. You can solve mysteries or crimes if you want, and even in those kinds of quests, or the kinds of quests that you get with just the Witcher contracts, sometimes there are multiple outcomes, depending on what you choose to do. Sometimes you might stumble upon a sentient monster that's not really doing much of anything to anybody, but people are terrified of it, and you get the option to either just kill it and let the people do what they want, or let the monster live and just basically tell the people, no, I'm not going to kill this thing. It's a sentient being, and it's not really hurting anybody unless you go and deliberately try to mess with it. And that will have different outcomes. You might not get your full payment or whatever, but you might get something else entirely. And other things can have different outcomes depending on how thorough you are. For example, there was one quest I did where I was sent to track down this one guy and just take him out. And so I followed the leads, and it led me straight to this one guy who was very clearly not right in the head. And so we ended up fighting. I ended up just annihilating the guy. I go in, I get my reward for my quest, and then I just go along and go about my merry way. Well, I see that my journal has updated. So I check the journal, and I find out that the way I solved that case is not necessarily the only way to solve that case. And so I went back, just as an experiment, and loaded my old save before I actually took that guy out, tried it a different way, and I had a wildly different outcome. And while I don't want to spoil some of these quest lines, because some of them are very, very good, with a lot of the side quests having writing that's just better than the main quests in a lot of games, which is just mind-boggling, but the simple fact of the matter is, the side quests are really where you're going to spend the meat of your time. They're really what are going to draw you into this thing. Because while the main plot is solid, it's really seeing what you can do with all these various side quests and how they will actually influence the outcome of various things that really makes the game much more satisfying. And aside from just side quests, Witcher contracts, there's all sorts of places you can go to explore, various treasures you can find throughout the world that might be guarded by powerful monsters, and if you defeat them, you actually get some pretty good items, or there's areas that might be overrun with monsters or bandits or whatever, and you can clean them out, and people will return to that area. You now have a new settlement you can go to, and have merchants that you can buy and sell gear with, and things like that. As well as just going off on scavenger hunts for Witcher gear and all sorts of things like that. And there's even a couple of mini-games, like horse racing, which I didn't really do much of. I did do a few here and there to get some better saddles and such, because that's basically where you get your better equipment for your horse. But I did do a few of the races, and I mean, if that's your thing, then go for it, but I didn't particularly care for it. I don't like racing in any game ever, so that's admittedly a personal thing. And also on a personal thing, I didn't bother with the Gwent minigame. Gwent is a collectible card game minigame that a lot of people have become obsessed with and want an actual physical version of it. And frankly, you can look that up yourself if you want. Like I said, I didn't bother with it. I don't even know the rules. I don't like CCGs at all, whether it's Gwent or Magic the Gathering or whatever. So I didn't bother with the Gwent minigame. There's tons of stuff you can do with those if you want. But I stuck with Witcher contracts and other side quests and scavenger hunts. So your mileage may vary depending on how much you get out of the racing and Gwent minigames. But there is a lot to do here. Lots of places to go, lots of things to explore, lots of things to do. And even not having done everything that there was to do in this game, my playthrough actually ended up being about 84.5 hours. So That's just doing the main story, the vast majority of the side quests. I did leave a couple that I didn't do, but I did the vast majority of the side quests. I did in fact complete one of the romance subplots, and there are romance plots in this thing if you want to go on those. But the only thing I am certain of, is because I got the achievement for it, is that I did all of the Witcher contracts. And that still only got me to 84.5 hours. There's plenty more to do, so you could easily have a 100+ hour playthrough. No problem. There is a ton of content in this thing, and for the most part, it's all very enjoyable, very good stuff. But then there are the bugbears I do in fact have with this game. There are some enemies where once you hit a certain point, it gets really tiring to fight them. Not so much because they're difficult, but because they're so easy that they're just annoying. For example, wolves and drowners. They're not hard to fight, they're just annoying. And despite having a fair amount of depth to it, the combat occasionally does devolve into just clicking the left mouse button until things fall over. And speaking of mouse buttons, there is the issue of controls. A lot of people had a lot worse problems than I did. I actually didn't really have all that much of a problem with the controls. On occasion, it would move in a way I didn't want it to, but usually it was my fault if I was doing that. For the most part, the controls are fine. You may want to play it with a gamepad, because it does have some slightly odd controls. Things like holding the shift button and pressing the left mouse button to do a strong attack versus just hitting the right mouse button in the previous game, where right mouse button in this one is by default parrying. So it's things like that that are just kind of awkward to get used to. It doesn't take long to get used to it, but it does have an adjustment period. And some people criticize the movement for being very imprecise. Sometimes it can be imprecise, particularly if you're trying to get to a chest or something that needs to be looted, but there's candles or lanterns or whatever in the way that you keep triggering the extinguish or ignite function for, which does get kind of annoying sometimes. But usually that's not that big of an issue. There is a fairly big issue with the combat getting repetitive after a while, because you just kind of settle into this rhythm where if you know what you're doing, you can actually emerge from a fair number of fights pretty much unscathed. They do have a few enemies that have that kind of bullshit difficulty where they just hit really hard or they can one-shot you. In fact, there were enemies when I was in the level 27 range that would still one-shot me. And that was on the kind of medium difficulty. There are two settings higher than that, so if you're one of those people who just complains about it being too easy, up the difficulty and it will make you actually rethink your tactics. Because if you do up the difficulty, you're basically going to be forced to use everything at your disposal, whether it be just swordplay, or the crossbow, or the various explosives you can throw at things, or the various potions and decoctions that you can make that will give you boosts in attack power, or critical hits, or your sign damage, and all sorts of things like that. And of course, when you get into the higher difficulties, the mutations that you can insert into these 4 slots that you have, and the various skills that you get, are a lot more useful. I mostly stuck to the ones that just did enhanced damage for swordplay, and I stuck to one particular set of armor. Now, there are 3 different types of armor in the game, light, medium, and heavy. They each have their own bonuses and detriments. I mostly stuck with medium, but your mileage may vary. Some of you may prefer to use more signs. Some of you may prefer just to be a straight-up melee combatant. All of this is pretty viable. Now, you're going to use a combination of your abilities depending on what you're fighting. Some enemies are weaker to fire, some enemies are just weak to your silver sword, some of them require certain oils to be applied to your blades in order to do more damage to them, some of them need to be confused with the Axis sign in order to really be effective against, all sorts of things like that. There is a wide variety of strategies available to you to just dispatch your foes, whether it be simple bandits or various lesser animals, or even things like the griffins and wyverns and things like that. And again, if you know what you're doing, and you prepare for a fight, you shouldn't have all that much difficulty with it. You may have more difficulty on the higher settings. I did not play it on anything higher than the normal setting, just because I wanted to have a baseline expectation of what the thing was like. If I play through it again, I probably will play through it on the Death March difficulty. Because particularly when I got to high levels, it became fairly easy, and even the big nasty stuff really wouldn't take all that much to defeat for me. Granted, by that point, I was just decked out in really powerful gear. I had all kinds of potions and oils and decoctions and everything to just make me basically an unstoppable juggernaut of death. So, there is that. There's more nuance to it, and I don't really want to go too far into the nuances of the combat system, but suffice to say, you do have a fair amount at your disposal, and it is a fairly deep combat system compared to most other RPGs. And it's pretty satisfying when you take out a particularly powerful enemy that almost one-shots you or does one-shot you before, and you go up against it and you manage to find a way to beat it, even if you're something like 10 levels lower than it or something like that. For example, I would go up against enemies that were in the level 30s when I was about level 21. And even then, if I was very careful and just took my time and was patient with it, I could still beat them. And that's pretty satisfying to know that your skills actually do matter. But again, it does get kind of repetitive after a while, so if you don't like the combat system to begin with, which I did like it can actually become a bit of a drag for those of you who aren't into that sort of thing. So that is something to keep in mind. You may want to limit your playthroughs to a lesser amount, but it wasn't really that much of a problem for me. It never really outstayed its welcome, because it does have some depth to it. Now, there's a couple of other issues I do have with it. First of them being fast travel. Now, it does have a fairly robust fast travel system. The thing is, you have to go to various fast travel points in order to go to other fast travel points. And to get to these fast travel points, you just have to discover them. So if you haven't been somewhere before, you might spend a good 10 or 15 minutes just trying to get there with all sorts of things in your way. So you could possibly find the fast travel system annoying. I certainly did on occasion when I was looking for certain things and I just didn't have any fast travel points anywhere near it and just had to spend the next 20 minutes trekking through the mountains or whatever, trying to find a way toward it. But that was usually when I was doing things like scavenger hunts, which make you go out of your way anyway. So there is that. But on occasion, particularly in Velen, it got kind of annoying trying to go to various places, because, okay, Velen is kind of a boring area. It's a lot of swamps and not much else. So when you get to Novigrad and its outskirts and Skellige, things get a lot more interesting. So I do recommend not staying in Velen particularly long when you start out. It's kind of like in Dragon Age Inquisition with the Heartlands, I believe it is, or whatever that area is you start in Dragon Age Inquisition. I don't have Inquisition, but people were constantly telling other players to just not stay in that area, because it does get very tiring after a while. Kind of the same thing happens in Velen. So what you may want to do is get leveled up in Velen up to a certain point, maybe go through the plot line in Velen, and then go somewhere else, and just come back to Velen later for side quests and such like that. Because there are quite a few interesting side quests in Velen, and quite a few Witcher contracts you can go on. Some of which are in fact high level, so there is incentive to actually explore and to go around the various areas of the game to actually do things. But again, Velen can be kind of boring. Skellige was really the most interesting part of the game for me, so that should probably tell you something, because Skellige is an area that is pretty wildly different from Velen and Novigrad. So if you're craving a change of pace from that, you can certainly go there. Now, with the fairly big bugbears out of the way, let's talk about a few of the things that were just mildly annoying. Like weapon and armor durability, where you have to repair your weapons and armor a lot because it actually does damage to them very, very quickly. You can go from having 100% durability on, say, your silver sword to right down to about 60% within the span of maybe 2 fights. So it's pretty annoying to constantly have to repair your stuff although at least your armor doesn't degrade anywhere near as quickly as your weapons do. Your weapons mostly degrade so quickly because you're constantly whacking things. There are ways to mitigate that somewhat. For example, not parrying and instead countering, where if you counter, then it actually doesn't do anywhere near as much damage to your swords. But your options there are fairly limited, and what is really a better idea is to just carry around a lot of repair kits. Now, this may be an issue early on because you'll be pinching pennies, and you don't really want to spend all that much money on your various usable items because they do actually get consumed. But once you get later on in the game, it gets a lot easier to handle, particularly when you find the crafting diagrams for the various repair kits, because then you can actually just get all the various ingredients which are cheaper and then make yourself some repair kits for very, very cheap, and definitely a lot cheaper than what they sell them for. Now, here's another issue I have. The crafting system, which is fine, don't get me wrong, this makes total sense, but you have to go to various craftsmen in order to actually be able to craft any items. So if you want to craft swords, for example, you need to go to a blacksmith, somebody who makes swords. If you want to craft armor, you have to go to an armor smith. You can't go to one or the other to do the other things. So for example, you can't go to a blacksmith to make armor because they just can't do it, which is mildly annoying, but it's not really that big of a problem. But the one thing that's kind of annoying about this is that a lot of the craftsmen are amateurs, and so they can't craft some of the better gear that you get. You need to find somebody who's at least a journeyman for a lot of it, and when you get to the Witcher gear in particular, you need to find master craftsmen. Now, master craftsmen are only unlocked through 2 specific quests. One of them for the armor smith, one of them for the weaponsmith. And these are fairly high-level quests. They're basically level 20-something quests. So you'll find that gear at that level is actually really high-level stuff. So you'll suffice with journeyman for the most part, but it does get kind of annoying having to go around finding which craftsmen are which, and then finding what you can actually craft there. But this in turn also presents a bit of a problem because the crafted gear is just flat out better than the stuff you can find. Namely the Witcher gear sets, which once you get those, there's basically nothing better. So you stick with your Witcher gear and you'll basically have the best gear in the game. There are a handful of items that are actually stronger than the Witcher gear, but for the most part, that's the best you're going to get. And by the time I ended the game, like I said, I hadn't completed everything yet, but by the time I got through the end of the plot, I was only level 34. So if you find something that's level 40, then chances are you're probably not going to actually be able to use it. So that can be kind of annoying. Now that may change when they introduce the upcoming expansions for Toussaint and the other area that they were wanting to put in, which will definitely extend the gameplay and probably give you a chance to level up some more. But leveling can be rather slow in this game, so if you really like leveling up a lot, you're probably going to have some issues with this, because this one makes you work for it. It doesn't just hand out level ups willy-nilly. So people who are looking for instant gratification probably aren't going to find it here. And this is really what ultimately influences my score on this one, because The Witcher 3, despite its problems, is an utterly fantastic action RPG with a well-implemented open world and lots of reactivity. But it's not for everyone. An RPG fan or fans of the Witcher series before this one will be able to go into this thing and get tons out of it. But people who really aren't into that sort of thing are not really going to get as much out of it, if anything at all. It's very much a European RPG at heart, and those are not made for a general audience. They are made for RPG fans. And it shows. They did try to make it accessible where they could, and for the most part, it is very accessible. But my experience with other European RPGs before this definitely colors my perception of this because I know what to expect from it. I knew that it was going to be somewhat of a slow burn, and that's exactly what it is. But people who aren't used to that are probably going to have to go through a fairly significant adjustment period, and that may actually be the thing that breaks it for them. But that doesn't mean it's a bad game, by any stretch of the imagination. No, The Witcher 3 is utterly fantastic as an RPG. And, frankly, Bethesda, take note. This is how you make an open-world RPG. Not that crap you've been doing since Oblivion. This is how you do it. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Like I said, it's not for everyone, but it is an utterly fantastic RPG, and it sets the bar pretty high for the future. And it definitely makes me all the more excited for anything else that CD Projekt puts out at this point. I am definitely looking forward to seeing more from these guys. Thanks for watching.